Hey everybody, thanks for returning to PopCon and for part 2 of The Art of the Arcade. Now if you haven't seen part 1, that's okay. They're not chronological. Well, actually, they are, but that's okay. It doesn't matter which one you watch. So after this show, please watch the other. It's a fascinating topic. Just like movies of the era, arcade games have their very original, very unique, and mostly hand-drawn posters. I'm Victor, your Gen X host, and we're going to pick up where we left off and explore the generally extinct but historical arcade artwork that was famous between 1983 and 1989. You'll remember it, I'm sure. This is part 2. Stay with me. Piquing our imagination and drawing us into their fantasy world, the arcade cabinets told a story. The stories had not always been clear, but that was about to change. In part 2 of The Art of the Arcade, you'll witness the transition of more telling and obvious cabinet illustration, while gameplay also changed to more complex graphics and storytelling. Although the cabinet art would change through the rest of the decade, and home video game systems were able to take the imagery to the next level, what we could all agree on was the sheer imagination that those arcade cabinets could create and the promise the artwork made to the player on the exciting adventures yet to come. And there's no better place to start than on the grid, the original Tron video game. If you watched part 1, you would know this was one of the first video games to be themed to an IP, a recent movie. And what a movie to pick for your first arcade game based on a current film. A film based on being inside a computer and playing the games. Tron stands alone as the images depict scenes from the film. Familiar or not with the movie, you could see what was in store, and although the game's graphics were even worse than the movie's valiant effort in groundbreaking special effects, you knew the concept within the game, and the film stills covering the various versions of the video game filled in the gaps. The popularity of the disc part of the Tron narrative made for a sequel video game in 1983 dedicated to the discs of Tron and continued the art format on the exterior. This was 1982 and 83, and the days of intellectual property-based arcade games was on the horizon. Even if those original stories were not sci-fi or fantasy adventures, but race car dreams, the artwork followed suit. Pole Position took car racing games to another level, and the artwork was both telling of the action to come and bold in design with hints of a late 70s graphic style that was starting to fade in 1982 when it debuted, and in 1983 for the game's sequel. Pole Position was popular, and so were games of this nature, as they were being designed for sitting cabinets to mimic your play experience. And so, with that different configuration, the cabinet artwork often took different variations to fit the style and arrangement. Pole Position is important and became the most popular coin-operated video game in the world in 1983 and 84. It even spawned a cartoon, as did Pac-Man and eventually others, on Saturday morning. Too bad the in-game animation wasn't this retro excitement that the original cabinet art made racing out to be. Spy Hunter. This combat driving game where you are the interceptor was inspired by, who else? James Bond. And I couldn't wait to use the oil slick whenever I got the chance. Like Knight Rider, Spy Hunter in 1983 allowed your car to enter and exit your base of operations, a Mack truck doubling as your command post. Back on the streets, the music was an exciting buildup of tension, and the gangster-themed cars were tricky. You just had to outsmart them while not killing innocent motorists. Incredibly popular and a top moneymaker, this arcade cabinet art had the spy motif down, and hand-drawn artwork was much more telling in nature and was well done compared for the art that preceded it. Spy Hunter still provided one of the best gaming experiences with its jet-like steering wheel, stick shift, and even a foot pedal to accelerate. The graphics were changing, and they were more and more convincing of the story being told than their predecessors. Tron was not going to be the only IP to translate to the game grid. Still rare, Star Wars seemed to fit the video game world perfectly, and in 1983 came in various configurations as you flew your X-Wing on the assault of the Death Star. Even though it debuted the same year as the OG trilogy's finale, Return of the Jedi. We all knew the story, and the graphics were like variations of the film's poster, and only served to excite us more, calling us into the seat of our own starship and blast TIE fighters on our way to ultimate victory. The dynamics of the graphics were a sight to behold, and were obviously story drivers, as well as the synthesized actor voices that elevated the experience with movie sound bites throughout gameplay. These IP-based games were few and far between, but as we know, they would not be outliers for long. Tapper from 1983 is all over the place. The most popular tabletop video game in Japan in 1984, the original had a Budweiser motif and even used beer taps as control sticks. Meant to be sold in bars for their video game needs, it ended up being all over the place in all kinds of arcades, so changes had to be made to not market alcohol to minors. The artwork would change based on the audience as well. The first being reminiscent of the opening of Cheers. It would have other variations in themes and graphics over time. Tapper had some identity crisis, and the illustrations have gone through some metamorphosis. The versions of the game included a bartender serving up a draft, or a soda jerk in Root Beer Tapper serving up Mountain Dew or Pepsi, but apparently not root beer. Now that all depended on which home game you had. Domino Man before it and Timber after it are the same concept, but nothing as popular as this bartender race against time, trying to serve impatient patrons while picking up your tips from this 1983 game that was featured in Wreck-It Ralph. Donkey Kong is no less famous than Mario, but this 1983 video game is a spin-off and takes the Mario character and not only fleshes him out as a plumber, but adds his brother Luigi to the mix and begins the eternal favorite franchise of sewer pipes and the creatures that exist within that underground world that Mario and his brother must constantly do battle with in an ever-evolving franchise with seriously lofty and expanding mythology. Taking the character from Donkey Kong created a brand of its own and was the best deal Mario ever made. Certainly better than that film. The arcade art tells the story and are pretty straightforward, duplicating the actual gameplay. Art and illustration are great representation of the plumbers and the challenges that lay ahead, while not a far cry from the bright colors of the source material, Donkey Kong. Alright, it's worth noting that in 1983, an incredibly talented and gifted animator and storyteller would lend his skill to the video game world with a new and burgeoning technology called Laserdisc. The story of 1983's Dragon's Lair upsets this show's own storytelling, as it sits apart from the rest. But it includes fantastic artwork. However, like Dirk the Daring, we'll just jump at the appropriate timing when the flash of light happens on our screen and move on to the next video game cabinet artwork, and we'll save Daphne and the Dragon for another show. I will admit this is my least favorite artwork. The cabinet illustrations between Part 1 and Part 2 are very different. The transition in 1982 and 83 brought less of an abstract imagery and more obvious advertising. This bright-colored, almost Sunday Funnies type graphic has no creativity. Although many people liked Paperboy, it left little to the imagination. Perhaps the life of a paperboy with differing difficulty levels, earning points for delivering the paper successfully while avoiding the usual pitfalls of the bike riding protagonist is your thing. But this illustration did nothing for me. It seems like there was no need for any exclusive or even creative art direction by 1984's Punch-Out! Long before it included Mike Tyson's endorsement and his name on the title, this was the most popular game in the US for that year. And the large font title with simple boxing gloves sold it for every player. You want to punch something? Play this. This first in a line of Punch-Out! Sequels was simple and to the point, and that worked. It's 1985 and Fantasy Films' Rage the Silver Screen. Initially released as only a 4-person cooperative play cabinet, Gauntlet is a fantasy-themed hack-and-slash arcade game. The title card at the top of the cabinet was suitably medieval, and the side art was the appropriate amount of sword and sorcery in easy-to-interpret comic book art of the time. The 4-player stations did come with artist representations of the characters you could play, and amazingly, they were even more believable. As at this time the graphics were improving and your imagination didn't have to make such a leap in believing what you saw on the cabinet is what you actually were playing on the digital console. In 1985, a side-scrolling platform, often cited as one of the most difficult games to play of all time, debuted. Ghosts and Goblins video game showcases the advancements of more detailed graphics with better use of mixing colors and design for an overall more diverse and realistic world build. The artwork expresses the gameplay, albeit depicting a very comic knight amongst lighthearted, frightening specters. It seems that there were 2 main versions of the art, the original and simpler light fair marquee sign with no side art, and then eventually it was updated with darker imagery for the marquee and additional side art that continued that motif, but with a no less, if not slightly different, knight. That may have been par for the course, as this knight would lose his armor and appear in his boxers whenever he lost a life. With the popularity came sequels, and perhaps the Ghouls and Ghosts version that followed depicts a true D&D type art that is far more foreboding. The magic was only a quarter away, and always just a few miles. It wasn't only at the arcade you found these imposing cabinets and sometimes tabletop video games, but you could find them in your pizza place and other restaurants as well as your grocery store. So tell me, which one of these was your favorite? And were you a master at any of them? Let me know in the comments and your video game experience. While you're there, please press like so YouTube can show this video to other like-minded viewers like ourselves. And don't forget to subscribe. Now on with the show. A year later in '86, a total smash and grab game that I could play. And I could play for a decent amount of time. If Rampage was there, I dropped coin. It was a fun, fast-paced adventure where you could not only move through the game at breakneck speed, racking up points, but also take out all of your frustrations on digital buildings and poor unsuspecting apartment dwellers. Also, it was fun to see some digital nudity as the three creatures turned back human when defeated and shuffled off screen in modest covering up. It was 1986 and the art said King Kong, but with a wolf and a lizard too, because, well, why not? It's the 80s and excess was in. Originally, the only real art was on the marquee, and it looked like the three giant destroyers beating each other up was the intent of the game, but this very hand-drawn art just drew you in. The cabinet, allowing three people to play, had some additional minor art of the characters' oversized footprints, but the proscenium art around the screen definitely told a completely easy to understand narrative. Punch, grab, eat, rampage. It was time. And Castlevania would be the first to start a franchise on a home console in 1986 that was also released on a cabinet around the same time. The arcade video game was unique to it, but the video game home cartridge seemed to really deliver the storyline in fantastic and detailed artwork, as well as inspire a generation of fans into a franchise that keeps growing today with various media. Perhaps the sequel is what made this game brand rocket to stardom, but it had to start somewhere, and in 1987 the original Street Fighter was an early example of competitive fighting games and introduced combination moves and 6-button controlling. The cabinet art was similar to both Punch-Out and Gauntlet before it. Simple line art graphics that said, martial arts, kick-ass, fighting game. That was all you needed to know. We had left the gorgeous abstract art of the earlier days of the arcade that would entice you into a world of simpler games, and now the gameplay could sell it, and the side art seemed like an afterthought, like today's movie posters, although the print ads were more highly regarded as artistic representations of the game itself. In the same year, Double Dragon followed Street Fighter's trend. More martial arts, more bright-colored warriors fighting opponents, and a slightly Asian-inspired motif, loosely based on Enter the Dragon. The simple artwork did nothing to enhance the game, just brand it, and branding was coming soon, and big time. There were more advancements in graphics and gameplay at the time, and it set the stage for future, continual side-scrolling worlds new to the medium. The magazine ads for this game were also more highly detailed, but at least they added the Chinese dragons around the cabinet screen for a little more immersion. As many new video games were going to home consoles first, then into the arcades by 1989, it was surprising that Golden Axe was released to the arcades first, and like Gauntlet, it was a side-scrolling hack and slash with all the too familiar fantasy visage. The artwork was simple line drawing, very cartoonish, and it told you what you needed to know. Rocky environments, dragons, and scantily clad warriors, and the simple sword and axe with the title on the side of the cabinet. You knew what you were getting into. You knew it would have to come to this, but branding was taking off in the late 80s. Original games would still be released in arcades, like the incredibly popular Mortal Kombat in 1992, but most games would either be released on home consoles first or at the same time as physical arcades, until the inevitable limited releases in the physical arcade world. However, like everything else in the 80s, a franchise that worked would be worked into everything, and the 80s was full of the best. Famous franchises were a way to continue the popularity, visibility, longevity, and of course, cash flow to that brand. And Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was huge in 1989. And with so many favorite franchises made famous in that era, it seems shocking that this was the first to be cross-marketed into an arcade video game. Where was He-Man, G.I. Joe, the Transformers? Nowhere to be seen. But this 4-person console had a strange new cabinet art design that incorporated both some highly detailed turtle artwork and some surreal photorealistic computer-generated cityscape right alongside live-action photos for characters of April O'Neil and Shredder. It was like Tron cabinet mixed with... I'm not sure. It hadn't been seen before, but everyone knew Turtles, and having this marquee in your arcade helped make it the blockbuster it turned out to be. The artwork is iconic, and the game would only start a run of similarly branded arcade games from the wildly popular intellectual properties of the time, specifically The Simpsons, that followed Turtles almost immediately and almost exactly. Well, old-fashioned arcade artwork was out, and bigger brands with recognizable faces and names would be more accessible at home on consoles and ultimately phase out of the arcade. The home video game system made a resurgence after Atari's ET soured the industry. Home consoles were getting bigger, better, diverse, and easier to attain. Nintendo blew it up thanks to Super Mario Bros. And Duck Hunt. The need of arcades would dwindle, and although machines existed for years longer, they languished in corners of malls, stores, and some restaurants, outshined by newer, faster, motion racing machines people could actually ride on, before falling into disrepair for newer tech and finally relegated to the out of order sign, and then finally becoming nearly extinct, save the collector and the recent popularity of retro arcades. I totally missed Dig Dug in part 1. We all know its impact, and its artwork was unique in that it actually attempted to replicate the pixelated 8-bit animation style on its cabinet illustration of the characters and the gameplay universe. Pinball, don't even get me started. That's a whole nother chapter in the art of the arcade. I hope you enjoyed looking back at this glorious time in our past with this fantastic artwork that has sadly gone by the wayside. A time long ago where illustrations fought for your attention and your loose change, competing for your coin in a brand new field, the arcade. Which of this artwork somehow told you exactly what the gameplay would be like? I want to know your arcade memories and your arcade artwork memories in the comments below. If you haven't subscribed, please make sure to do it. Come back to PopCon anytime with loads of other great content from the greatest era of pop culture. You know the one. Mid-70s through the mid-90s, but mostly the 80s. Until next time.